we think that in 1989, when the massacre at the Tiananmen Square happened, we think it was completely appropriate for the European Union to impose this embargo upon China. We think that at that point it was a good response on human rights violations, and we think that to some extent it was really an effective means because the Chinese government felt the consequences of this embargo. We do not believe that this this arms trade embargo is still effective, and also therefore not appropriate anymore. So why do we think it's not effective anymore? What we now see is that China very much is seeking the cooperation of other big countries, right? China is in deals, military deals, negotiating with Russia, but also ex-Soviet states such as Azerbaijan, and is also talking with countries such as Pakistan and India, countries that all have lots of military power, that are very good at the technological advances, and they're all very willing to invest. They're all willing to invest because they're willing to pose a block against the West, against the European Union, and against the United States. This is the reason for this is because we're so not willing to negotiate with them on these matters. We think that at this point, this only has negative consequences for the European Union, and therefore we think we want to change this, right? The only reason why it is still in place currently is because the United States have pressured the European Union a lot to keep it into place. Because already there's been negotiations and talks a couple of years ago in which I think like Germany and Sweden and Belgium and the Netherlands, probably some other very sensible countries, already fought for the idea of lifting this ban. They tried to lift it together with some conditions, but we on site proposition do think we should just lift it altogether without conditions whatsoever. Okay, so why do we think that's a good thing? We think that's a good thing for 3 reasons. First, because it gives us better relations with China. Then secondly, because it gives us better soft power for negotiations on human rights violations. And then thirdly, why it's really nice to get China as a proper hard power ally. Third point is a point that my partner Jordi will discuss. But before I begin, second please.
So, seeing how with past experience and future prospects, America is more likely to still remain our major ally, why would you neglect America and go to China instead?
So I think America will always need Europe as an ally, right? We also think that in many instances we help America, especially with their missions, with our trade, etc., etc. America will always be very much afraid of China and Russia, and will therefore always prefer us as an ally over these other countries. We'll therefore don't think that we'll lose America as an ally. On the other hand, we also think it's a good thing to start building on new good relations, right? So that brings nicely onto my first point. What will this do? Okay, it's a sign of goodwill, good effort towards China, right? That we're now willing to talk to them again, to trade with them again, to see them as a fully respectable partner in that sense. No, thank you. Which is something that China really wants, right? Because they've also been asking and pressuring Europe to do this for a long run. We think that this can be very good for foreign policies, right? In the past, things have been a bit difficult every now and then with discussing these things. If we make small steps like these, we think that that's a step towards actually engaging with them in the sense of saying, yes, we also do respect you, and we actually not only want to demand things of you, because we keep on, as Europe, demanding things, saying we want you to do these kind of reforms, etc., without putting anything back for it. We think that not only this is a good thing for foreign policy, but also for security, because it means there's less hostile atmosphere between these two blocks, right? Because it means that we're no longer really trying to, really willing to draw this particular line between that block and ours. We're saying no. We think that at this point we're willing to go past that. Then the third positive thing about that is that we're finally be able to have a technological trade when it comes to army. No, thank you, arms. They are, and with they I mean China, but also India and Pakistan, are very much advancing at this point. Right? We think that it's a good thing if we could now learn from them and that we could share our knowledge and thereby create better security on international threats. Okay, then secondly, why this is a good thing for soft power for human rights violation. I already touched on this for a bit, right? Because currently it's very difficult for us to talk to China and to say that we do not, like, we no longer want you to steal livers from like prisoners because we think it's kind of bad. Well, at this point, because we've always been the person looking down upon China and saying we're on like the moral high ground, saying like you should do this and we're only like asking this without anything back. As soon as we say no, this is this is like a step from us, we're willing to do this, and especially we're willing to do that, of course, because it's not being super effective anyways. That at that point it creates a better atmosphere for these talks. We think that at that point it's also easier to go into and to really talk to them because we now see them as a yes.
Would you consider that there is a lot of negotiations, trade, and a lot of other channels that are actually existing today? China is not isolated.
No, it's not isolated, but in some senses it is. In which senses? In military army, right? Okay. We think that it's perfectly fine that in the status quo, we buy lots of clothing from them, and if we look at the Primark, then half of it is probably made in China. That's great. We think we want to expand this. Why? Because the military is very much a political thing, right? This is not just about the products that we sell or about like the money we make. This is very much about trust. This is very much about international cooperation. That is just simply less the case when you're talking about selling jeans or like t-shirts. Okay, then our third point, I'll only briefly introduce it before you already talks about it. So why we think that China as an ally is would be a good thing, right? We see that China very much is now involved into certain regions. For example, we see that they invest a lot in Africa, they invest a lot in Pakistan as well, and they have their interests in other regions such as Afghanistan, etc. We think that if we can now work together with them, especially because they have such a big army, because they have like a very big budget, that would be a really great thing. If we can do like peacekeeping forces and then have like the Chinese army work with that, that would be grand as well. But more on that from my team partner. So because we think better relations would be good, and because we do not think it's effective in the status quo anyway, we beg you to propose.
Speaker for that speech, and now call from the leader of opposition.
Before I start, if you're going on PI, please speak loud. Hearing problems, so please be loud. I'm also loud as a result, so sorry. Cool, let's start. Basically, the premise is, and I went to the POI, is that China is very much solo in this game, and there's a lot of interest that it's going to develop in different ways. And basically, what we're saying is today, the free market and pretty much the trade within China is this softened element that's something that brings those two, the two doctrines together. And this is something very important that we need to understand. These are two blocks, as they call them. It's two doctrines that cannot sit together. What it means is that one doctrine needs to give up for another. For example, a totalitarian doctrine of China is not acceptable, nor in the US and not in the European Union. The reason they're claiming it's anachronistic reasons and it's not longer valid. So we don't need this because we did it a long time ago. But let us go back and understand and frame why the embargo is not only for military purpose, but also political purpose. The idea of the embargo is not only to not provide arms, which if that's what they're intending, then I remind you still that China do use a lot of firearms, mainly the light firearms to kill a lot of its citizens. Also in Tibet, yes, it's not Tiananmen, but human rights are not being kept there. So if this is their interest, it still exists and we still should keep it. I'm saying this is not the most important thing. The most important thing is how we soften doctrines in order to get to political bridging, and this was one of the reasons of the embargo. We saw that in South Africa, where the embargo was in order to change the government. We understand the embargo of weapons is not going to change the government, and this is why my first point is going to be, another quick rebuttal, first point is going to be how do trade while there is this embargo, how the trade serve those purpose and why exactly when we're going to lift this embargo, we're going to break the chain of events that brought us to this great cooperation with China, which still need to be worked on. So first of all, their premise is, the second point is going to be, of course, that I'm going to explain why it's bad towards the natural alliance, not just America, of the European Union. This is also Korea and South Korea and Japan, which are major role players in this game. So first of all, the correspondence with the United States and the way they work together work both ways. It's not that America relies only on Europe, Europe also needs America. If you betray them, and I'll further in my analysis, they were probably not going to be there when you need them. Now we need to understand that the world we're facing today is not the world of like Third World War, Second World War, post-Second World War. We're not on an open campaigns right now between those two doctrines. We're talking after the Cold War and a case that states pretty much the balance is a political power and not just a military power, but the military power is the most intimidating force for maintaining this political power, because the Cold War ran about the ability to produce arms and hold them, and today we're in a post-world that says we want to decrease the amount of weapons that we have. We want to decrease the amount of actual wars that we have. Yes, it's not perfect. We have a lot of wars, but we want to decrease them because it hurts the economy. Now, we got something about soft power not developed at all. We pretty much have no idea what it means. Soft power has many ways to be treated. We're saying that you don't want to support the Chinese army because they're committing stuff that are not okay. They will enforce the government because they are the strong arm of the government. It will reinforce the totalitarian force, which we, as the European Union, are not capable to live with because we are in two separate doctrines. Meaning that we need the change that happened, and now I'm going to go into the first point. So, no, the way the trade opens, okay, basic logic. When we have two countries trading, there is a mutual interest to expand this trade. And that means that these two countries are not likely to go into war, because if I control or all of your money in that way or another, trade, it means that I have a conflict of interest if I'm actually going to harm you. Meaning that, and this is what exactly happened in China. China back in the 80s wasn't a very developed country in regards to dealing with the West. And therefore it started, of course, with the doctrines to get closer to North Korea and to Russia because they're in the same block of doctrines. What happened is that when with the trade got bigger while the embargo was there, we had a political incentive. Because say you can't attack us, and now we're in mutual relations that money trades hands. Meaning that they accepted Western laws of trading. They take on Americans and Western names. They take on American and Western culture. They learn English in school much more than they learn any other language because they know that they need to trade with these countries. Their pronunciation is so perfect, so you feel comfortable to be with them. They have Chinatowns, not just because of immigrants, but it also normalizes the relationship between them. Now, this is super important because the army, by nature, because they said it's a political force, and we agree that army is a political force, by its nature needs to grow power. What happens, and this is a great example, and I'll take it in 5 seconds, that we're going to take in 2005 with China, and South Korea, and the United States. Yes, please.
So the embargo has existed since 1989. How has it helped Tibet?
The embargo existed, and I'm going to further analyze now, because, look, they had enough power at a certain point to rule the whole that region. America interfered pretty much, and also the European Union interfered, and they reinforced their allies there. What happened is that now China is at a certain point, they need to work very hard to get developed. It means that they work very hard on, if they need to choose, work very hard on army or take an easier path through trade, they will invest in trade because this is much more beneficial for them. Now, what happened in 2005? There's a clash in China Sea, that also named Korean Sea, between Korea and South Korea, Japan, and China. America had to interfere because China used a lot of military force, what pretty much stabilized hurt the economy for about good 6 months, and pretty much broke a lot of the agreement that were there, and they were meant to eliminate Japan and South Korea from evolve militarily. And what happened is the next result is that Japan changed its constitution so they are not limited anymore for a specific amount of military force, meaning that now, after that, because China grew up strong in military, also Japan and South Korea did this. Also conflict with North Korea. What means is they shaped the whole area and affected the American approach towards this area and also the European approach. Europeans had to interfere in 2005 in order to balance this gap just because China got military stronger. We're saying no to that.
Let's thank the speaker for that speech, and now call on the Deputy Prime Minister.
Dear panel, I'm going to talk about 3 things today. I'm first going to talk about why the US isn't going to be so scared that they're suddenly going to leave all of the European and the support that they're giving. I'm going to talk about the legitimacy they tried to talk about the EU supporting this or lifting this embargo. And I'm going to talk about why China is a valuable asset and a partner in this global conflict. But first, one point of extraneous rebuttal, because we heard something really strange, like in the last sentence of the speech, right? It said, yeah, but the South Chinese Sea dispute would have been solved it's going to be more difficult or something when we lift embargo. This is status quo, right? We see that, if they want to, we're not going to defend that the South Chinese Sea dispute is going to be solved, or in both sides now it's going to be as bad, right? We think maybe if the US or the EU would have been partners, would have been allies, that they could have talked to China instead of the US having to send ships and planes to there, that would have escalated better, even worse, right? Okay. So about the US being super scared and leaving the EU, we don't think that's true, right? We think that, as Sarah already talked about, is that the EU is a really important asset, right? Not only in sending troops, we see that in a lot of missions that the US wants to do, they need to get global support. They often ask the EU so that to get more support. We see the EU is always often very prepared to do this, but also just because of economic reasons, right? Because there are big economic ties between the US and the European Union, and they need each other for that as well. But also simply because the NATO they have, right? The US isn't simply gonna abandon the NATO or vice versa because they see that the NATO is very important in global conflicts, for example with Russia, right? So that okay. But also, we think the US is probably already scared of China because they have the second or third largest army. We don't think that anything they want to claim is going to be different, because we see that having this embargo didn't change a single thing. China has second largest army, is investing more and more, making more modern. So you see that it didn't have any effect. So if the US is scared of Chinese army, they're ready now. No. Okay, so that is said, it's principally we cannot support this because China is killing people with weapons, right? We think under the status quo it's also happening, whether you lift this or not, that's still going to be a thing, that's going to be in both sides of the house. We think that we probably have a better checks and balances if you're going to be allies. If we go talk to China and say we lift this embargo, we want to work with you. That means that it's more likely that you treat each other more as friends than as enemies on the comparative, right? That means that it's easier to use soft power to say, hey, maybe what you're doing in Tibet is wrong. Maybe we should talk about it and see if there are other options. But then also we see that sometimes it's really nice. Although they're doing bad stuff, although a country's doing bad stuff, it's still nice to lift embargoes in order to talk, right? You see, for example, with Iran, that the US also have difficulties with Iran. We see that sometimes it's nice if you lift the sanctions so that you become more friendly to each other. Because it's always easier if you say to a friend, hey, let's do this, than if you say to an enemy, because they're more likely to listen to that. So when you compare it, we think we have more so far to more easily deal with that. Okay. So why then is China a valuable asset and a part of the global economy? We see that China already has the second largest army and is modernizing really quickly, right? We see that they're already involved in a huge part in the Middle East and in African countries, in the sense that economically and they're trying to use more and more soft power in order to stabilize the country. We think that in the future they're also going to they're going to be more sending forces in these global missions as well. We see that the reason that China is doing this because they see that already in their area they have already a lot of soft power, and China likes to have the power there. We see that they're more striving for global power as well. They want to compete. They want to say to other countries, they want to have more power in the rest of the world as well. No, we see that then they have two options, right? We see that they could ally with the EU and work again fighting IS, for example, or I don't know, fighting terrorist organizations like Boko Haram, etc., etc. We see now the EU is sending the message by saying we don't want you to build arms because we think that de facto it's wrong that you're building armies. We think that we don't want you to build your army. We think de facto you're using for the wrong thing. We think that you force China to not talk to the EU, but to go to other camps. We think this other camp is much worse, right? Because we now see that China is much more likely to go to Russia. I'll take you in a sec. To go to Russia, because that's a close partner that's also looking for global power, and they can't go to the EU because they're treating them an enemy.
You agree that China wants to use trade, and we showed that they're using their military power in order to dominate and bully the area. Why do you want to give them more power?
Okay, no. So I explained already that they already have the second largest army. So we don't think how on your side of that is going to be better. But moreover, I explained to you when you treat them more as an ally and you talk to them, you use your soft power, then it's more easy to say, hey, what you're doing in Tibet is wrong. Or when you have cooperative missions, for example, fighting ISIS, you can talk about what groups you want to attack, how you want to attack them. We think they have more control, more accountability, more checks on how China's using their arms when you're doing missions cooperatively, where you talk more to them, right? Okay. So what we think, why is it really harmful that the China is more pushing to the camp of Russia, right? We think that Russia has a really big incentive to have a force that matches the NATO, because they're really scared because the NATO is closing on the borders. NATO is close to the borders with Soviet Russia and is showing their muscles, right? Like Putin on the other hand also wants to show their muscles, and they're scared because they're so close to the border. What they do, they find bigger partners in order to match with that. We think that China is a really big partner because they have a lot of soft power as well, and they have a really big army. What that means is that the EU or the NATO also gets afraid. That at the moment you have Russia and China more and more allying, we think that's really scared for the NATO. What that means is that you get some sort of everybody sending more and more troops to the borders, escalating the conflict, right? Because there are more and more troops involved. We think, on the other hand, when China is more working with the EU, more working together with the EU, we think it also means that Russia sees that they're losing a very big ally, so they're more afraid of NATO because they have less muscles to show. We think that Putin is less likely to actually go across these borders, does go and does more crazy stuff like they did in Ukraine, for example, right? We think that's amazing in the sense that they lose a big partner in which they cannot show their muscles anymore. We think that's a win. We think that also because China is a really large army and they're looking for more and more global power, we think it's good if at this point we say to you, we trust you, we think that you can use your armies for good. Why? Because simply we need the whole world to cooperate, for example, in fighting ISIS, because now it's seen as a Western thing, that the West is all doing this, and a lot of Middle Eastern countries are blaming the US. When we see that the whole world, China as well, is involved in this, we think it creates more legitimacy and less blame on the West for all of these reasons. Very proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker for that speech, and now call upon the deputy leader of opposition.
Okay. So, what we get from the government is that it would improve the relations between the West and the East, between the EU and China. what we didn't really get is why specifically arms? Why do we need more weapons in the world? Why would we need more technologies that destroy the world in a world where we want to lessen it? I'm going to have a few points of rebuttal, then one large, very long point about the transfer of technology and the betrayal of EU allies in Asia and the US. It's going to be all there. Second point is going to be a regulation normalization through the market as it is today, and a better tool. Okay, quickly. So they've said they turn to different allies to get more weapons if the EU and US won't give them, won't break the arms embargo. So the thing is, why would China want more arms? In a world where there's an open free market, in a world where we strive for peace, in a world where the whole point of the agreement with Iran, for instance, wasn't on military basis, but nuclear power towards benefiting its civilians, toward electricity, towards non-military missions, why would China request more arms? There has to be some sort of interest there in gaining more power in that region and gaining more military power, and that's what's important here. With Iran, in a comparison, we did not have a military use of power. The whole compromise there was against the military use. So that's the first point of rebuttal. And in a place where human rights violations still exist, in a place where there is a totalitarian regime, which we can't supervise and can't control, and can't really get into the supervision of that, and can't really influence the change of politics in it, and in a world that goes towards disarmament, there's where we don't need to sell more arms to. Transfer of technologies and a whole point. Why is it not good for foreign policy? First of all, leaving Japan, leaving Korea to stand on their own in an engagement against China is totally against our interests. Korea and Japan have interests of, and they are democracies working in that region that stabilize it against those that are not democracies. They're against North Korea. They are the allies which we help so they could stabilize that region. Once we turn to China and open the arms embargo agreement, that would hurt specifically Korea and Japan that really are afraid of China becoming an active player, a strong active player, that would try to military hurt them. Why is that a possibility? In a second, but yeah, go first.
Okay, so how is the EU now backing up with arms Korea and Japan? How is that? How can they not do that when you lift this weapon embargo?
Okay. The question, the answer to the question would be the fact of deterrence. It's in my point, so I'll get to it right away. Why is it bad for security? That would answer your POI. Security will be hurt much more in an instance when we give China that arms embargo, and the stability in the region would be unbalanced. Why? Because China is now an economically very, very strong player, and it's going to grow and become even more stronger economically. The thing is, what it lacks is the technology and weapons that would make it military strong in comparison to the West, in comparison to the EU combined with US, combined with democratic forces in that region. What happens with that is we have deterrence. That means they would not start even small conflicts in small regions where they would rather circumvent these conflicts. I'm not talking about a world war, I'm talking about actions in Tibet, actions in southern Russia, actions against Japan and Korea and some islands. They would deter from using that force now because we have technological supremacy. Once we sell weapons and sell technological supremacy to them, they would lose that deterrence. No. The basic thing is, being still a totalitarian regime, we cannot possibly supervise that regime. We cannot go and inspect that regime, how it uses its weapons, how what strategies would it have with those weapons, and there are no real checks and balances like we have closely with Iran. Wow. Okay. No. Once they have a strong military, it's going to be a change of balance and a tiebreaker. Now they're, as I've said, equal to forces of the West. No. The second thing is, not only does the Asian side gets hurt, but also the US. The US views China still as a military threat. We still have that in their analysis. Why is that? It's because it's the only power growing in the world that is strong economically to withstand sanctions and to withstand an embargo by the US itself. Giving freedom to releasing the arms embargo would hurt the strongest essential ally that we have, the EU, which is the US, and that because we would actually transfer power from its what is called an intelligent, like a military threat that we have from China that we don't have in the rest of the world. Well, okay. The bottom line here is that we lose an essential allies that stabilize the region, and second of all, we lose the market from those allies that would go to other markets, that would go to, for instance, as they've said, Russia, in order to balance that out in order to engage with China. No, second. Well, second you had, no.
Yeah, okay.
No, okay. Sorry. Okay. Regulation and normalization through the market. So, what happened in the EU in 1957 was the Rome Treaty that meant that coal and steel were absolutely dispersed in Europe as essential goods that would, using them and cooperating and making them between all countries would prevent future war. That means what we're doing, what the Rome Treaty did was not to sell arms in order to prevent more war, was not to increase the deterrence to prevent more war, but exactly what the market is doing now, selling basic goods, then depending on those basic goods and depending on each other, therefore there's no incentive of going into war. If you enforce more arms in that region, you would only incentivize the Chinese to use that arms because they're not stockpiling arms in order for it to sit in warehouses. They want to use it. Wow. So they haven't shown us why the benefits of selling arms specifically turn China into more open. There's a lot more damage in doing that. I call you to oppose.
Thanks to the speaker for that speech, and now for
Okay, 4 points to you from closing government today. The first two, I'm just going to try and clear up what's happening on the top part and clarify the debate, clear the ground for our remaining extension. So the first two are the situation which China is militarising currently. Then I'm going to talk to you about why support for the Chinese state is in principle acceptable, and then our two impactful extension points here are how the embargo affects the perception of the EU by China, and how this affects the ability of the EU to enforce to enforce more condemnation on other problematic regimes and nations such as Russia and Iran. Okay, so it's a situation in which all graph is interwoven. So the situation in which China is militarizing, right? So we feel that China is militarizing. But first of all, just an interesting fact for you, right? China has a lower military spending as a percentage of GDP than the US, Japan, India, or Pakistan, right? While China is slowly militarizing, right? It is militarizing to an extent that is less than other states in the region, and is doing so in response to the militarization of other states surrounding it, right? What we see with Japan, for example, is an increasing amount of nationalism in that country because of the ongoing economic situation there. We see a huge increase in the amount on the military budget of Japan, right? They're building like a huge navy to try and try and stake a claim to some of those forces, right? We feel that Japan also has had a history of like problematic relations with China, right? It has never apologized for the horrific war crimes that happened in World War II when Japan invaded China, right? We also see with India, right, which invaded China in the 60s, okay, that they too have increasing military spending. What we see, like since 2011 onward, is increasing military collaboration between India and Japan, right? This is painting a picture of where China is reacting as a passive economic power, right, to a threatening, to increasingly threatening, like militarization around it, right? It needs to be able to defend itself, just like any other state should be able to defend itself, right? That's why the USA has such a big military budget. That's why the UK has a big military budget, and that's why lots of European nations also have militaries, right? militaries are important in order to be able to defend your nation from potential threats, and China should be just as free to engage in that as anyone else, right? We also think that, like, just to clear up this point, Africa, right? I feel like actually Chinese involvement in Africa has been an incredibly beneficial thing because they've engaged and been able to like build infrastructure there. I think that's a good thing. They haven't got like a significant military presence there, right? But also, just like China doesn't invade other nations, right? For me, what I was trying to get to opening that they wouldn't accept was that can you name a single time where China has invaded another sovereign nation in the past 60 years, right? There isn't one. That's because China isn't that isn't China's strategy. China, as they rightly say, is a massive economic power, and its rise is part of not engaging in military invasions where it can help it. Its rise is about, thank you, its rise is about like engaging in like economic stability, stuff like that, right? So all this point about, well, you'll piss off the US if you like help out China, right? So here's the other thing, like the US and China are completely interdependent and reliant on each other. China owns like just a huge amount of US debt, right? Like it has bailed out the US after the recession, and they're completely economically dependent on each other. China produces goods that it sells to the US, and the US buys those goods, right? A war between them, or any sort of like military like entanglement between them, would be a complete disaster. No one wants that. That isn't what this debate is about, right? Like China just wants to grow. Okay, so now to the actual extension, right? How this embargo affects the perception of the EU by China, right? Because so China sees this, right? Sees an arms embargo by the US as a moral condemnation of China as a state, right? Then what this means is that if you're a Chinese policymaker, or if you exist within China, you have to disregard the EU's moral condemnations of other states, because to say that those are important risks legitimising the very condemnations that have happened against China by the EU, right? What we see, to some extent, from the characterisation we get from OI, right, is a perception, is a worrying perception within like the EU, right, of China as a threat, right? This isn't very good for the way that China like perceives the EU and like the potential relations for China to engage with the EU, right? That's some stuff that Obi talked about. I think that's really important, right? What we feel is more important, right, is how this effectability of the EU, right, to get like good stuff happening with Russia and Iran. One interesting point here, right? If the EU doesn't sell weapons to China, China can buy weapons from other states, right? That's why China has been buying like weapons from Russia, right? We think that's problematic. We feel that's also problematic because it opens up a channel, right, for relations that are explicitly harmful because they're in that there's now better diplomacy between China and Russia that happens there, right? We see the $1 trillion oil and gas deal that happened like a few years ago between Russia and China, right? This undermines the ability of the EU to put sanctions upon Russia when they engage in problematic with the whole Ukraine issue, right? Because Russia feels pressure less when they can access other markets and sell stuff to other markets, right? We feel that's bad. We feel that China wouldn't do that so much if they could engage with us in a better way and they felt more capable of endorsing the hard war condemnations that we do. Opener.
Yes, it's not mutually exclusive because the trade can happen whilst having an embargo. We're saying that enforcing a totalitarian country is more likely to invoke a local dispute that's already happened.
Okay, sorry. I mean, so the part of embargo is you don't sell places. No, so sorry. When the EU says that it isn't going to buy Iranian oil, for there's another example, or says that they're going to put economic sanctions on Russia, when Russia and Iran can have economic activity with China instead, it mitigates the impact of what the EU do, which means that the EU has less pressure to put on those countries to make them stop doing problematic things, right? So it has less pressure to force Russia to not do those bad. It can put less pressure on Russia because Russia knows it can like sell its oil to other nations. It can sell those things to other nations. When Iran, when there was vast international consensus that people wouldn't buy oil because of its continuing nuclear weapons program, right? Because of its its problematic record with human rights within its own nation, much worse than I think is happening in China right now, right? It was able that situation was able to continue much longer because Iran could sell a huge quantity of its oil to China. China was willing to buy that oil and was willing to not endorse international condemnations, not because China is bad, right? But because in order to obey those international condemnations would be to endorse the very condemnations it has had against itself. It cannot possibly do that, right? Because China has to see itself as a moral actor, and it is a moral actor, right? Which means that which means it had to rationally do those things. What you get on the comparative, right, is you get less of that occurring when the EU opens up and says, he opens up, doesn't really condemn China and sees it as an equal player and an equal actor, right? Which means that China is more likely to to engage in the same more kind of nations and be a very, very helpful ally in enforcing pressure on those problematic regimes, right? Those are the reasons that we feel Xi Jinping in this debate today. Conclusions and more we beg you to propose.
Second speaker for that speech, and now call upon the member of opposition.
Is it okay if I use Madam Speaker, or would you prefer if I use Chairperson? All right, thank you. Yes. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today, from side closing opposition, we would like to bring to you 3 points. First of all, we would like to analyze for you why the burden lies with China if they want to become our ally, on the basis that we generally make allies with people who are ideologically compatible with us. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about more in depth of why China does not fit the criteria of being our ally and will probably not in the near future. And thirdly, I'm going to analyze to you why the message that sort of flew around in the first half actually has an impact and is important in this debate and actually does give efficiency, which opening population claims doesn't exist because China still gets weapons. There are different kinds of efficiency, and the kind of efficiency we're trying to achieve is one where we are sending a clear message to our allies and also to more of our enemies. Before that, 2 points of rebuttal. First of all, we get this idea that China is not really militarizing at all because they have the lowest spending per capita on military functions in the region. Well, that's quite easy. First of all, you have an economy of 1.5 billion people, and secondly, when you're running state capitalism, which allows you to skew economics in a sense where you see it as fit as possible, meaning that obviously China is militarizing at a much greater rate than all of its neighbors, which is why it can easily invade Taiwan, Taipei, and also Nepal, and obviously does have the power. Furthermore, we do not believe that Japan is actually a big threat to China. We believe it's more bad blood, historically speaking, that causes the conflict and the rift, and actually China militarizing causes the effects in Japan, in Japanese militarization, because Japan is afraid of retaliation from the Chinese side, and they are afraid of the actually giant Chinese army that can crush them at any time, given that they have enough nuclear arsenal to destroy the world hundreds of times over. Second, yes. So onto my constructive. So first of all, why does the burden lie with China? So they first of all want to trade. According to first proposition, China really wants to trade weapons with us. If this is true, then we say they have to also follow in certain sort of criteria. Because the difference between the weapons embargo and regular trade is that regular trade liberalizes, and we do see that in China. Regular trade is slowly but surely creating a middle class. The problem with specifically trading weapons with China is that the weapons are used not only against other sources, but against the middle class to shut the middle class up and to leave them and to take away their ability to talk out against the government, to shut down students protesting against the government, and to fight against the government institution, which is how China abuses this sort of system.
So,
yes.
okay, even if what you tell us is true, that they're both found each other, then why do we sell weapons to Japan and not to China?
We actually don't sell weapons to Japan. Japan is infamous for the fact that, actually, yes, another point of rebuttal. Japan is actually famous for the fact that they are a demilitarized state, which completely relies on its defense system, on the United States. Actually, thank you for reminding me of that. I completely forgot. But yes. We do. Japan is actually famous for only having internal policing, but not a military state, but not actually a state military. Second point is my second point is who we make allies with. people generally, and the difference between allies and partners, because it is very possible to be China's partner without being its ally, because we can trade and interact without China without having to become their ally, as is what the proposition is essentially trying to say, that we should become politically more interconnected with China, which is essentially becoming their ally. Now the difference between an ally and a partner is that a partner can be a mutually beneficial system where both sides agree, but an ally specifically is an extension of your ideological values, specifically in the political arena and international relations, where we say, look, we make allies with people who agree with us in order to strengthen our position within the international arena. If China does not stand on the same ideological lines as us, then they do not strengthen our ideological position within the international arena, which is why we should not attempt to become ideologically allied with China, but rather just remain in a partner sort of relationship where both sides benefit. Whereas we don't see that the EU would massively benefit from a weapons trade with China, because as the second proposition already pointed out, most of the weapons China buys come from Russia anyways. We don't see why they would particularly now buy EU weapons. That means the effectiveness of this motion, obviously as the proposition agrees, lies not within actually selling weapons and with actually selling arms, but it lies within the message we sent. And this is where I get into my third point, which is based on the first two, which is the impact the message makes. But before that, I'll take first.
So if China would want to get more arms right now in CESCO, they will buy more arms from Russia, right?
Yeah.
They're probably not going to get more arms. Japan's not going to be more sad because we're still defending them. The difference is whom they're buying on.
Right, but this is where my message comes in, because what are we telling Japan when we're no longer having a weapons embargo on China? What we're doing is essentially the same thing that we did with the Iran deal, because the big problem with the Iran deal wasn't that we were making a deal, it's that we completely left our allies out of the scoop, where Saudi Arabia and Egypt felt massively betrayed by the fact that Obama left them out of the deal, where they felt that their interests were not safeguarded by their ally, who claimed the entire point of this deal is to protect his allies. That means the moment that your allies feel betrayed, they feel fearful, and this fear is problematic, Madam Speaker, because when our allies feel fear, they escalate. We see now that Saudi Arabia is also striving towards building nuclear arsenals, as is Egypt, because they no longer trust in the protective umbrella that the United States are providing. And the same will happen with China the moment it feels that, with Japan, the moment it feels that its allies are abandoning it. And furthermore, we say that, look, not only are we telling our allies with this message that we're essentially abandoning, but furthermore, we're telling our enemies, or more directly, concretely, Russia, that if you, if you deal long enough with the sanctions and embargoes we lay upon you and continue with your stride, at some point where we just figure out, oh well, it's not working, so Russia should continue what it's doing right now, because the message we're sending is this: you do bad things long enough, and we figure it doesn't work, so we stop and we let you get away with whatever you're doing. And this message is harmful because by that we're giving a sense of legitimacy to the annexation of Crimea, and we believe that is incredibly harmful and very much against NATO and EU, and therefore also EU interest within the area. And for these reasons, Madam Speaker, we beg you to oppose.
The government of Britain.
Sorry, continue. Okay, so to conclude this debate beside opposition, I'm going to talk to you about a few main points. So firstly, I'm going to clarify the reality of China and why all the things that opening and closing brain don't actually kind of happen or don't improve the situation. Why sort of mitigate kind of the harms they say and say that actually, they're not the harms aren't changed by having this policy or not having this policy, and then talk about principally why we should have these policies, why we shouldn't have this policy, which is what Ethan might talk about, and then finally, why having this policy makes the world a worse place and makes more people get hurt when we can't have China on our side to implement really important policies that stop people in other places getting hurt. So firstly, the reality of China.
So we heard from open opposition that we should just cut trade with China in the EU, and that would be or like reduce trade with China, and that would be a much better way to solve this issue. We fundamentally disagree. Ethan's talked to you about how the economic power of China is so great that we depend on them as a European nation. We think that government saying to like their people, oh well, you know, we're going to cut trade with China because of these like internal issues that we don't quite agree with. When people can't buy their goods at the cheap price they expect from China, firstly, it's just never going to happen. It's not a practical solution to that. Secondly, we had that embargoes work. Look at South Africa. Well, South Africa worked because it was a nation that already relied on European support and European trade. China, because of our actions, because of our disconnection with them, has never had to rely on that, and therefore has never developed that like dependency on the EU in the same way, and this is developed alone. Having a closer relationship, selling to China, treating them like as equal partners, is actually what creates that kind of balance of powers, and means that when we go to the negotiation table with China, we actually like have things that they need from us, rather than forcing no negotiation, cutting off those ties and making us like not economic like partners that work together, but like people who are like sort of enemies in a way, not enemies, but like are actively like not liking each other. And we had like, you should oppose China because it was like authoritarian regime. Basically, like no, like look at regardless of your like political views, China is successful. China has high standards of living. China has economic prosperity. China's technology is developed. Fundamentally, it's also a major player in the international markets, and to ignore that partner, to ignore how you can influence that partner in a better way, or like change that partner in a better way, is a very naive way to look at it, because it simply like suggests that, you know, we can't, you know, it's much better to work with the power to change it slowly, rather than to simply say, especially to a very powerful power, rather than to say, look, we don't agree with your views, even though perhaps they aren't as bad as other nations that we support that are semi-democratic or that are, we think there are worse situations, we still support them. Like closing government, closing opposition, literally said Saudi Arabia is one of our economic trading partners. They probably are a worse regime than China to its people. Then we had like China's responsibility to come to the West from closing opposition. No, for all the reasons we talked about, China's developed alone. China has made itself, like made the West rely on it. China has like created a situation where we like depend on them because like they didn't have the support from the beginning. They're highly independent. No, thank you. What we need to do is increase trade and increase our relationships so that we have more interdependence for all the reasons Ethan talked about, which I will go on to. Then like, sort of, okay, onto my next point, mitigating all these like harms. We said like China harms Tibet. Well, firstly, these weapons embargoes are not like actually affected Tibet in any way. They're still problems in Tibet. Secondly, China has just sourced its weapons from other places like Russia, so it doesn't affect that. Finally, the situation actually probably gets worse when you have this this sort of like suspicion between Europe and China on their internal policy, because the EU is perceived as an enemy of China. Like rhetoric with like political capital doesn't work so much in China from the EU, and saying like, well, it's probably a bad thing. Then we had like when you have less like Western influence, because like China can spin a rhetoric internally that is like, oh, well, the West is against us and doesn't understand our internal situation. We probably think that that's a worse situation for trying to influence a positive situation in Tibet. Secondly, like opening opposition, saying this policy will harm our relationship with America. Well, Ethan's dealt with that really well. Look, the US is already an economic ally with China. The US actively goes out of its way to stay friends with China, to not be in conflict with China, because it holds massive amounts of its debt. We had, look, European input into China, like a lack of European input in China has made China not reliant on the EU in any kind of way, apart from like to buy their goods, which the EU has that demand for. Secondly, because of this relationship, it means the EU and the US are having to go to China to be the negotiator. That's the way around it is, because they didn't get involved early enough, they didn't like set up connections early enough. Then again, open opposition said China having weapons means other nations such as South Korea don't have weapons. Well, exactly. Like the embargo has forced like China to go to Russia for their weapons. Russia is probably a less responsible provider of weapons. Russia probably is more engaged in like stirring up trouble between these nations because it's beneficial to them. They are probably a worse person to trade with or to have any kind of influence over the weapons industry within China. Then we had, open opposition said there are more arms in the world and that's bad. Well, fundamentally, we don't think that being like selling arms actually increases, like having an opportunity to sell arms increases the demand for these arms. We think that that comes from external factors. We just think that when we improve the sort of like relationship between China and the EU, that we have way better things. We don't think it increases demand. Then we had EU has a military monopoly over China. And that this would change the power balance. Well, no, we think the EU heavily relies on America. We think that America is friends with China. We think that the EU actually probably has a weaker military thing than China, because China's been forced to go elsewhere for its weapons, to Russia, etc. And to be fair, China isn't even that militarized, and Europe isn't even that militarized, so the difference between the two is probably like inconsequential. So Ethan talked about why this is principally wrong, and why this makes things worse, like why this policy makes things worse in the world, and we should get rid of it. So firstly, like, the EU itself is a checkered history. The EU cannot claim to be a complete global good in the world. It's had bad things. China recognises this and it sort of doesn't like the EU for saying you have to have moral authority over us when essentially the EU is not perfect. Secondly, Ethan's already told you, we provide weapons to the surrounding nations. We provide weapons to Japan, regardless of what opening government says, because Japan's just put massive warships around all the islands that it's in conflict with China to. We provide weapons to India and other surrounding nations. But that fundamentally, it's not selling the weapons that make us an ally. It's not selling the weapons that makes us in conflict. Okay, reduce allies, okay, blah, blah. Okay. So Ethan brings you the real harm of this debate. When we don't talk to China, when we don't engage with China, they're much more suspicious when European nations go, look, Iran is also really bad, same with Russia. In fact, they don't actually want to engage and they're less likely to engage. This makes all the sanctions and policies that can actively cause real change in the world not work when China is not involved in them. This means that the countries like Russia and Iran who have active policies of going and causing trouble in other nations, such as surrounding nations, such as Iraq, such as Syria, such as Ukraine, these are much more harmful to other nations. These countries go out of their way to cause trouble in other nations to monopolize their power, when we can have real sanctions imposed on these nations that will stop them being able to do that. And we can't enforce that because China is suspicious of our motives, because China feels actually maybe they side more with these countries than us because we're really aggressive to them and they don't see themselves as a bad partner. We think that this makes all those things inefficient. Now, look, we already see evidence of this working. The way that I brought on North Korea, we see that China, because of an increased relationship with the West has reduced their relationship with North Korea because it's embarrassing to defend these countries when it undermines a relationship with these other powers. We think we can do more of this when we don't have this policy. We think we can do this much more effectively when we don't have this policy. I urge you to propose this motion.
Thank the speaker for that speech, and now call upon the opposition whip to conclude the debate.
Dear panel, the question about this debate today, because it is hypothetical, is what is the more probable scenario that we're going to see from lifting the embargo on China? Now, from side government, we're kind of hearing attempts to make it seem like China is more probably going to somehow magically feel closer to the EU if it's going to sell a couple more weapons, because it's not going to be massive scale trade. Upon that, we all agree in terms of the weapons themselves, and somehow we hear that our allies are going to feel safer with China militarizing more, with the help of one of their major allies that's protected them from China militarization so far. So I'm going to make 3 flashes to you on this debate. First of all, could we get closer to China even if we wanted to? Secondly, should we get closer to China even if we could? And the fourth one is, what will happen if we do? Now, before that, a couple of quick points of rebuttal about the whole Saudi Arabia trade, and we already have really problematic partners. Well, even with Saudi Arabia, we don't trade massive amounts of arms. We don't support their policies internally in terms of social treatment of women or religious minorities. This is not something that we support, and we outright say it out loud. In regards to China and Japan and the whole analysis of that context. On the one hand, they're saying, well, because China is militarizing a lot, then it's causing Japan to militarize. But now, if we're going to help Japan militarize, if we're going to help China militarize, Japan is somehow going to feel less threatened. I don't understand how this spiral effect is going on. I'm going to talk about that in the should we get closer point. And another point of rebuttal about the whole condemnation of, are we going to get more legitimacy now to condemn China than we've gotten before? So if we can't really get closer to China, even if we wanted to, which I'm going to show in my first point, then how are we going to get more legitimacy by now telling them, we're fine with you buying weapons, we're fine with you using the weapons any way you want, oh, but wait, I'm not fine with you doing specifically that. So we believe that sending a stronger message of, we are not going to trade weapons with you because we do not believe in your foreign and the way that you conduct your foreign affairs with the use of force, which China often does, despite government sugarcoating it. we believe that this is a much stronger way of condemnation of China rather than being muddled and ambiguous in the message that we're sending to the international community. So into my points. First of all, could we get closer to China? And here, we really do not get an analysis of, is this even possible, even if we remove the embargo? So, from my partner Yossi, and we already heard that the weapons embargo on China is not that massive scale. China already does get most of its weapons from Russia. It used to get it from Russia in the form of the Soviet Union, and also from other very problematic regimes. It's also traded with North Korea, which is one of its only trade, the only trade partners of North Korea. So really, the reliance of weapons in terms of the Chinese context is not on the EU even if. So if we were to try and get closer to China by selling it weapons, is this actually going to work? And here, Yossi brought to you the role of ideology. And is this something that sits with our ability to ally ourselves with them in the international community? And what we're saying is no. Why no? Because China and Russia, their relations go deeper than just military ties or economic ties. There is an ideological divide between us and China, between the EU and China. There is something that cannot make us become full partners and allies as we would like to be. So just as China has been trusting Russia more than it has been trusting the EU, because Russia holds more like-minded views of sovereignty, of belief in the use of force, of exercising national power in order to promote your interests, being very pragmatic in your approach to international relations. These are all things that sit very closely with Russia and China. China is probably going to stay closer with Russia because of all these reasons. It's still very far away ideologically from the EU, so we're probably not going to get very closer to China, even if we did remove the embargo, because it's not about just selling weapons and, oh, they don't like us, we don't want to talk to them. So even if we could get closer, let's say that China was to somehow like our ideology all of a sudden because we're trading weapons with it now and it didn't want to be friends with Russia, which is its major trade partner, as they said, in energy and military and everything for decades in the last decade. Should we? And here we're also saying no. First of all, because of the strong message point that Yossi's been trying to kind of translate to you, and we're saying we're saying that China does far too many problematic things both internally and externally for us to be able to promote. Furthermore, with the allies point, what we're telling you here, and there is a very, very good analogy with the Iranian deal. When you become closer to a major threat to your allies are going to feel betrayed. And this has been beautifully exemplified for us when Saudi Arabia, Israel, a lot of Gulf states like Qatar went against the Iranian deal, regardless of its actual details or the actual impact that it's going to have. But just because they feel that this is going to spiral into a security threat, you're probably going to cause Iran to have more nuclear power, and this is going to spiral into more and more militarization of the whole region. We think that this is very likely to going to happen with China as well. So if we send a message to our allies that we're siding with China right now, we're going to make them feel less secure, more likely to act on their own, regardless of our own opinion, and also more likely to stray away from us and cut ties that we have so far relied on. Yes, Rosef?
Okay, so the major economic trade between the US and China makes China have a lot of money to invest in the military. Are you also proposing trade embargoes?
Thank you. Well, no, we're talking about military embargoes specifically. We're not talking about trade embargoes because, as you said, and also came from first up, we don't mind having just trade embargoes because that is not a message that we're bad with. Yossi told you. Trade brings more moderation, brings more cooperation, brings more understanding. We're fine with that, but we're not fine with sending a message to the international community as a whole that we're changing our allegiance. Also, in terms of our alliance with the U.S., our proposition itself said there are major pressures from the U.S. For us to not cooperate more with China. Why should we go against our most major ally in the international arena on whom we're relying for gas, our major economic market, also military trade, and do something that goes against its interest, also our major ideological ally? It does not make sense, and it's us relinquishing our position in the international arena. So what will happen if we do remove the embargo? What we're seeing is very likely China is going to remain the pragmatic regime that it is. It's going to maintain ties with us as long as it's beneficial to it, but it's also going to pursue its national agenda as it has in the past. It's going to probably stay closer to Russia as we've been trying to show you, and not really come closer to us as proposition would like to have us believe. We're going to be harming our ties with our allies, both major and regional, and we're going to see, as a whole, much greater harms to canceling this embargo than from keeping it. And because of all these reasons, we beg you to oppose.